fortunate to have these two highly qualified leaders in their industry. Teresa Garcia-Moore is Technical Development Manager in Food, Beverage, and Agriculture at the Sustainability Consortium. She holds a law degree from State University of Londrina, Brazil, as an LLM in Agricultural and Food Law from the University of Arkansas, a PhD in Agricultural Policy, also from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. Prior to joining TSC, Teresa worked as a research assistant at the University of Arkansas, conducting research in food and agricultural policy. She also worked as a legal consultant in Fayetteville for Kramer Detergents Incorporated, where she was responsible for advising the company on legal issues related to chemical industry regulations and on the implementation of corporate social responsibility. Drew Slattery is Human Dimension of Change Lead for Farm Journal's Trust in Food. He specializes in applying human dimension theory to drive behavior change to empower agricultural producers in the U.S. continuously improve their operations' environmental, financial, and social outcomes. Before joining Trust in Food, Drew served as communications manager for Washington, D.C.-based Global Environment and Technology Foundation. Drew holds a master's degree in international agriculture with an emphasis on technology adoption from Oklahoma State University. He was raised on the Angus cattle operation, served as president of the Texas Junior Angus Association, remains active in beef cattle production today. So we're going to let you share your screen, and then we'll welcome you to the meeting. Whoever's.
Yeah, thank you very much, Norm. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and you can let me know if you see everything you're supposed to be seeing on your side. Well, hey, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We're going to dive right in. And Norm, if there's any problems with audio or you need me to pause or go back or anything, you just let me know, okay?
Okay.
Sounds good. So thank you, Norm, for that great introduction for Teresa and myself. Just a little bit about our two organizations. I'm going to talk about Trust in Food for just a second, and then Teresa is going to share some more about her organization. Farm Journal is probably a company that most of you are familiar with. Top producer, drovers, bovine veterinarian, dairy herd management, milk, agweb.com, the pork brand as well. These are all some of our platforms. About 3 or 4 years ago, Farm Journal decided that it was time to plant a flag, to draw a line in the sand, and to take ownership of the sustainability space and movement within agriculture. Being a 145-year-old company that has been serving producers for generations, we felt that that was our duty. So Trust in Food is essentially the sustainability division of Farm Journal. We take everything that Farm Journal can do as a company, and we deploy that to help producers and advisors and the whole agricultural industry move forward as it relates to sustainability, conservation, and regenerative issues. Teresa, you want to talk a little bit about TSC?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Norman, for the opportunity to talk about our research on farmers' perspectives on data. Very excited to be here today. And I want to start with a brief introduction about the Sustainability Consortium. So TSC is a global organization of stakeholders working together to best use sustainability science to help companies make their everyday products better and more sustainable. And we like to emphasize that TSC is a science-based organization, so we translate the sustainability science into business tools that suppliers and retailers can use. Also multi-stakeholder informed, so we engage stakeholders to implement these tools to really drive change across supply chains. And the goal is really to create more sustainable consumer products, and to be able to do that, we're really focused on impact at scale. And next slide, please. And so with our group of stakeholders and members that include companies, other universities, and nonprofit organizations, TSC created a platform called the Sustainability Insight System, or THESIS, which is a sustainability measurement and reporting system for suppliers to understand the sustainability story of their products. And TSC has assessments for all the different products that you can find in a supermarket, ranging from single ingredient products like lettuce, cucumbers, or meat, to complex products like cookies and ice cream, for example. And each assessment has science-based, multi-stakeholder vetted key performance indicators with metrics that suppliers can use with their retailers, investors, and consumers year over year to benchmark their sustainability performance. Some of the key performance indicators and metrics that we track include fertilizer use, greenhouse gas emissions, and water use intensity. And that's where we really align with other tools that collect farm level data that you all might be familiar with, like SAI platform, field to market. So the data recorded into these tools or calculators, for example, can be used to automatically calculate responses to some of our KPIs. So data is really essential to everything that we do at TSC, especially farm level data. So I wanted to share with you all a story about a coffee supplier that came to us looking for improvement opportunities. And this supplier in specific had very good data about the manufacturing level of their supply chain. So they do everything. They collect scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, same thing for water. They collect their water use intensity for owned and contracted facilities, PCR content for packaging. All very good data at the manufacturing level, but they still receive low sustainability scores year over year because most of the environmental and social impact of food production happens at the farm level. So that's where most of our KPIs related to food products are focused on. And the supplier, they don't have visibility into that on-farm level data. So they're missing information about this big part of their supply chain, which is how the commodity was produced. So how much fertilizer, how much irrigation water, how much soil erosion. And this is a story about one supplier, but it really illustrates the challenge that we face, because almost half of food companies and retailers that complete thesis assessments are not able to determine the farm level management practices for their agricultural inputs. And so if you're not really able to capture the sustainability performance of a product, if you don't have access to that farm level data. And so next slide, please. And so we were really trying to find out why that was, and it still is a problem. Why is it that suppliers and retailers don't have visibility into farm level data? And to know that, we really need to understand farmers' perspectives on data. And so in just a few words to summarize the context of the report, we can say that farmers are humans, and to change farming, we must change humans, but humans are complex. So we need to understand what are the barriers that farmers are facing, not only to collect that farm level data, but also to share that data with suppliers and their retailers, and ultimately consumers and investors. And as we all know, consumers are increasingly interested in knowing the story of the farm and of the food that they are buying. And to know that, farmers must be willing to share their sustainability story. So that's the background of the report. Drew, if you can go to the next slide. So we collaborated with Trust in Food to understand a bit more about farmers' perspectives on data collection and data sharing. And the big goal here is really to understand how we can better support farmers in that transition to farm management information systems and other related technologies, and perhaps inspire them to share their sustainability story. And this is the second year conducting this research, and we see that overall, we see the same trends in the first and second report. But one thing that we want to highlight is that it's not really possible to do a direct comparison between the first report and the second one, because the sample is not the same and the questions are not the same. So keep that in mind. But we have very interesting findings to share with you all, especially if you're a trusted advisor or if you're part of a farm management information system, or a decision platform. And so with that introduction, I will hand it over to Drew, who will talk about our methodology and provide an overview of our findings.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. And please jump in if I miss anything or you want to add anything else as we go through this. To talk a little bit about our methodology on this survey, this was a confidential digital survey that was sent out to row crop producers across Farm Journal's database using the online survey platform Qualtrics. Only qualification for being able to take this survey was that you actively farm at least 50 acres of row crops and you grow at least one of the 9 priority crops. We'll show you what those crops are here in a minute. We did not incentivize or pay anyone to take the survey, so this was all out of their own free time. And only completed surveys were considered in the analysis. We removed all of the people who partially completed or did only a portion of the survey. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the survey sample who completed this survey. So we had 610 total people complete the survey, and here's the geographic breakdown. You'll see most of them are in the Midwest, but there's a significant portion throughout the rest of the US as well. So keep this in mind as we're going through our questions. A lot of the results that we see might be driven by this geographic breakdown. So we've got age here on the left. You'll see about half and half split, 60 over 65 and then 35 to 64 within a very, very small percentage in that 18 to 34 bracket. Education level of producer on the right-hand side. Biggest portion is those with a 4-year degree, but a significant amount with other degrees as well, other levels of education as well, I mean. So on this slide, we've got income level on the left and total acreage on the right. So probably no surprises here. Skews a little bit larger and a little bit higher dollar value for farm income. And then, of course, most people didn't want to answer that question, so we don't know what they make, but we can guess based on their acreage. I do want to call out that it's a fairly significantly equal split, other than that really small percentage there on acreage. So keep that in mind as well as we go through. So here's the 9 priority crops that we're dealing with. People could respond to this question in many ways. They could answer or they could select any multiple crops. So you'll see that most producers are corn and soybean farmers. A significant amount are wheat. Other was significant as well. And when we looked into other, that was a fill in the blank question choice. We had a lot of folks who were growing silage or hay or forage or some type of animal product. Animal feed products, outside of corn or traditional grain. There was also a significant amount of individuals who put things like dry beans or other edible crops there. Then we've got barley, cotton, potatoes, sugar beets, and rice as well. So we'll jump into the key findings now and walk you through some of those. So right out of the gate, one of the things that we realized from this survey is that there is a significant digital gap. So 62% of our respondents to this survey said that they do not rely on farm management information systems exclusively. I want to pause for a second and define that term FMIS because we're going to use that throughout. And I know that that term maybe means different things to different people, but for the purposes of this survey and what we're talking about here in this presentation, FMIS means absolutely every type of digital farm management and data collection / analysis software. So no matter how detailed it is or how all-encompassing it is, whether it's something like Climate Field View or it's something really specific for a very specific measurement on a very specific piece of equipment or something like that, we're lumping it all together into FMIS. So keep that in mind as we go through. 28% said that their primary data storage method is paper or some sort of analog to paper. And then most importantly, 50% of those who don't use digital have ever even considered transitioning to digital. So let's think about that for a second. 62% don't rely on software exclusively. 50% of those who don't use digital have ever even considered transitioning. That seems like a significant number of producers, and to not have ever even thought about going digital, that's a pretty scary statistic, I think, from my perspective at least. And we know that some operations maybe are ending with this generation and there's no one to take it on. So it's kind of just, seeing it out. But in operations that are going to continue on as they are, there needs to be a plan in place, and there needs to be a little bit more forward thinking about some of these things. We know that paper dashboard, having a notebook on the dashboard of your truck worked yesterday, and it might work today, but it's probably not going to work in the future, and certainly not work as well as it could or should. So we really need to be focused on these individuals and these operations who aren't thinking about digital, or who maybe haven't ever thought about digital just because they're scared or it doesn't apply to them or whatever. We need to think about how to make solutions work for those operations. So the next thing I want to call out here is the differences in marketing outlets. We ask everyone who took this survey what their primary marketing method is for their crop. What do they do with it? How do they sell it? Who do they sell it to? And we found that those who sell primarily to a food or fuel company are a little bit more likely to be using FMIS than others. So we need to look into this a little bit more before we make any conclusive statements, but we think that there's a way for buyers of crops, meaning food companies, fuel companies, feed companies, whoever is buying the grain or the product from the producer, to empower the producer to transition into more digital data management to help with that transparency throughout the supply chain. So again, we don't want to make any conclusive statements today, but this is something that we're looking into because it seems like there might be not only incentivization, but pressure that can be applied from downstream in the supply chain. I'm going to switch to this slide now, which is a little bit of a graphic on some of the barriers to collecting data. So we ask specifically, what barriers do you face in collecting more data than you are now? I want you to pay special attention to the very top and the very bottom of this graphic. So you'll see that the least selected barrier is that there is no benefit to collecting more than I already am, or the belief that there is no benefit to collecting more than I already am. So I guess to look at that another way, 75% of the respondents here, or 77% of the respondents here believe that there is benefit to collecting more data than they already are, right? That's pretty huge. That's a good thing. We want them to see that benefit and to believe that that benefit is there. Down at the bottom, the biggest barriers you'll see are cost, training or understanding, equipment, and then time, data connectivity, things like that. These are more outside barriers that it's a lot harder to address without some sort of outside support or outside the farm anyway, infrastructure to help. So thinking about these barriers to adoption, another question we ask is that with cost barriers addressed, if cost was of no issue to you or no problem, or you had access to the capital, whatever, would you increase your precision technology, or would you start or increase the use of your precision farm tech? And I mean, almost unanimously, people said yes, which I don't think should be a surprise to anyone, but that does reinforce how significant the cost barrier is here. And on the one hand, if we want and need producers moving into a more precision and more digital world, we have to realize the real barrier that they're facing in terms of capital that these things cost to set up and to get going. And however we circumvent that issue, I think is going to work. I don't know that there's one silver bullet solution to it, but it is something that we need to think about, and we need to be working towards understanding how we can reduce these capital barriers that producers are claiming to face. So here's a really interesting finding that is probably going to be relevant to this group as well. So trusted advisors, right? That's anyone from your agronomist, your retailer staff, whoever the farmer identifies as a trusted advisor. We know that they play a critical role in adoption, but what we found is that those who are supporting the digital transition are sparse. So only 52% of producers who took this survey said that they have a trusted advisor who could answer questions related to FMIS and digital ag. The way we asked this was, hey, producer, if you had a question tomorrow about digital ag or precision or FMIS or whatever, do you have someone that you could call immediately to ask that question to? Do you have a trusted advisor who could help you answer that question? And only 52% said yes. So that's right out of the gate. That's a huge problem, because if there's not enough trusted advisors, if not every trusted advisor, to be honest, is able to answer questions or to support the transition into a digital environment, then that's going to be right out of the gate just another huge barrier that we have to deal with. In last year's survey, we asked a slightly different question. We asked if their advisor had suggested they increase their data collection in the past year, and only half said that they had. So 2 years in a row, about half of the advisors to the producers taking the survey have either not been able to support or answer questions related to digital transition, or are not pushing digital transition on their own. Both of those things are a fairly significant issue if we're thinking that we need to move more farms into a digital environment. But significantly, those who do have such an advisor available to them are 24% more likely to be using FMIS. So we do see a pretty solid link between the two. When the advisor network system is able to support and is supporting producers, they're more likely to be doing it. So we need to figure out how, as an industry, can we empower and incentivize the trusted advisor network to be able to support producers in their digital transition. And whether that means things like, I mean, we can get as tactical as sales quotas, right? Or incentives and bonuses on moving digital environment subscription systems, or getting people hooked up, whatever. But it can also be things like training for the trusted advisors, so they know how to answer questions, even if they're not servicing a specific product or a specific technology line or stack. They're at least able to answer general questions, and that gets the producer to a step closer. Because this survey, again, was brand agnostic. We weren't asking about a specific brand or company or technology type. We were kind of lumping everything together. So we ask about collecting and sharing data separately for some specific reasons, but this is essentially the breakdown on sharing more data than you are today already. The thing I want to call out here is there in the middle with the little floating thing off to the right. You'll see that there's a significant jump, 18% jump in no benefit to sharing as opposed to no benefit to collecting. So 77% of farmers think that there's benefit to collecting data, but way less percent think that there's a benefit to sharing data. And that's something that the downstream industry is going to have to address. Groups like the companies that Teresa works with at TSC, these are food companies, these are beverage companies, these are the companies who end up producing the end product. There's got to be benefit flowing back to the producer from somewhere if they're going to share their data. For example, things like marketing claims on food. This was no-till crackers, or this is no-till Cheerios, or this is cover crop Triscuits, or whatever. I'm just throwing out names and brands. Those are just examples, arbitrary, but there has to be some sort of benefit provided to the producer if they're going to create this transparency into their production system. And they simply don't see that, and they don't feel it, and they don't believe it today. So that is something that we've got to work as an industry to start to create, and that has to come from downstream companies and groups and organizations. The other thing I'll call out here is down at the bottom, privacy, fear of regulations. That's another issue that we're going to touch on here in a little bit, is trust. There's a lot of trust issues around data collection and data sharing and what's happening with my data. So again, that's another issue that we need to think about, especially as we're trying to grow the number of producers who are using digital agricultural tools to collect and share their data. So getting into that trust issue, or some of them, there's transparency concerns. 65% of producers said that their customer does not have a right to know how the crop was produced. And this sentiment is shared equally among FMIS users and non-users in our survey. So that's a pretty significant gap, because right out of the gate, if you're saying more than half of producers say that the end consumer, whether that's a person in a grocery store or it's a giant food and beverage company, don't have a right to know whether they did no-till or they did cover crops, or what their nitrogen application rates or method was, or if they're doing yield monitoring or things like that. Because that immediately closes down everything that happens after that, right? There is no discussion about sharing data or collecting data if you don't believe that they have a right to know. So we need to work on rebuilding and building trust with producers, ensuring that their data is protected under robust and honestly farmer-centric, farmer-designed, farmer-first privacy policies and data policies that are not exploitative of their data or of their work, because that is their intellectual property at the end of the day. What they do to their farm and their nitrogen rates and their everything else, that's intellectual property that they have worked generations to figure out how to get to it. And, you know, we need to think about it in that way and not just think about it as a bunch of flat industrial data. So thinking about the human context of that, I think, is really important. And we've got to rebuild that trust, because without that trust, nothing else is going to work. Continuing in on trust, though, 73% of respondents said that they don't trust private companies with their data, meaning something like a food company. 58% don't trust the government with their data, their farm data. But this is an important one down at the bottom. Conversely, 71% do trust their financial institution with their data. And that's probably a pretty easy thing to understand. You know, farmers may not always like their banker. They may not always have a great relationship with their banker, but they at least, for the most part, trust their banker. And so I think that historic trust relationship really leads itself to farm level data. Now, how we make that work from a supply chain transparency component, I don't know today. Maybe there's some way that we can think about running these supply chain transparency programs through financial institutions, or maybe it's just taking lessons from the financial and banking sector around privacy, around the relationship, around building that trust, and applying those same principles to farm level data. Just like, you know, no one can walk into the bank and ask about their neighbor's bank accounts, right? We shouldn't have to deal with that from a data perspective either. So maybe it's just about looking at the lessons that banking can teach us and how we can apply those things, and using that to build trust throughout producers. So moving on a little bit into software platforms. And again, we're not talking about specific brands here this year. Satisfaction with FMIS outputs is mediocre. So we had about half of users, a little bit less than half of users, saying they're entirely satisfied. About 6% said they were entirely dissatisfied, and the rest were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. So that's almost half who aren't quite entirely happy, but aren't quite entirely unhappy. And that's an issue. And all of these issues together that we're talking about here, whether it's trust, whether it's benefit, whether it's a capital barrier, whether it's satisfaction with the software, all of this stuff adds up, right? It might seem like one thing plus one thing plus one thing, but it turns into this situation where the farmer, the producer, sees all of these things in their mind, and they say, well, that's not even worth messing with. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to do it. It's not worth my time. So we've got to keep in mind that these things all add up, and they're all impacting the producer at the same time. And so not being satisfied with the software, hearing your neighbor complain about the software's interoperability with other software platforms, or how they have to jump through a bunch of hoops to do just one simple thing, or they put in all this data and what they get out is not what they need, or it doesn't help them, or they don't know how to understand it. That all has an effect. That all has a ripple effect throughout the producer community. So every single dissatisfied FMIS user has the potential to prevent others from jumping in. And we need to think about that really critically and try to prevent that, because we want we want producers championing FMIS, right? Regardless of the brand or the company. We want all the producers saying, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever. You got to get in on this, man. But if they're not doing that, then that's a barrier that we're going to have to face and deal with. Refining these decision-making tools could be a really easy way to do that. I say easy in air quotes because it's probably not easy or simple, but it's at least straightforward. FMIS and digital ag organizations could evolve their solution sets to better meet the needs of farmers, simplifying and reducing the time commitment, as well as the interoperability between different systems and trying to have different data in different places and different types of data, and certain systems don't talk to each other and they don't talk to each other easily, and there's just too much complexity in all of the walled gardens that are out there. So figuring out how to streamline that and bring everything into a cohesive and simple solution set that provides the producer with what they need. Because another issue that we run into and we see is that a lot of FMIS that's out there can sometimes not be providing the producer with exactly the output that they want or the output that they need. It's maybe the output that another group in the supply chain needs, whether that's the retailer or the agronomist or the food company or whoever. We've also got to be thinking about the farmer and the types of decision-making work that they do. So they need to be able to put something in and get something out and it be perfectly usable to them. So thinking about how to improve that as well. So here's a breakdown on incentives. So basically, if we provided you as a producer with this incentive, how likely would you be to increase collecting and sharing of data? And the important thing to see here is how high everything is, right? Everything is 61% or higher. So you could walk away from this and say that, gosh, almost any incentive is going to work to some degree, to a fairly decent degree. And that's probably true. So it's less about what is the right incentive and more about let's just start incentivizing. There's probably better incentives for better situations than others, but I don't think we're going to find a bad incentive necessarily unless we're just getting real crazy with things. But if you look down there at the bottom, 86%, tools to make their operation more profitable, and then training and technical resources at 76. Both of these are things I want to call out, just because, again, what we see and what we hear in the data is that producers are not getting enough value out of FMIS. And when you combine that with the problems that they face, whether that's in data collection or interoperability between systems or whatever, that starts to add up and they just get annoyed and they're out, they're done with it. So if we can make the profitability, productivity side of things easier for producers to get to decision-making power on, I think that's going to be a win across the board. So let's talk a little bit now about implications for conservation. Better data, of course, means better decision-making on the farm. You're able to make smarter decisions about nutrient application, nutrient management, as well as pest and fungicide and everything else. But that's really, really critical for conservation because without it, it limits what we're able to do from a conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture perspective. We also know that data collection and management is a prerequisite for carbon markets and other similar ecosystem services programs. You might be able to squeak by with some paper records today, but long-term, we know that if you want to be involved in carbon markets or other related, similar type payment markets, you're going to have robust, regular digital data. And so getting ahead of that now is the only way to make it work tomorrow. We also know that digital management is one of the most direct paths to increased profitability in row crop agriculture because of its implications to productivity and your ability to better manage not just the financials of your operation, but all of the inputs and all of the cost that's going into what it takes to grow that crop each year and grow that crop well or grow that crop to a profitable productivity level. So we had a few questions coming out of our research that we want to continue to look into. And I know that Trust in Food and TSC will be looking into these over the next few years. We do this survey every year in about February, March, April is when we try to run it. kind of right before things get super busy in a lot of the country. But thinking about what we want to continue to look into, how can we use emerging carbon markets, ecosystem services markets to drive digital and FMIS adoption? How can we use those to leverage producer adoption of these technologies? How can we better empower trusted advisors and their networks to promote adoption? So again, going back to that, half of trusted advisors can't or haven't been promoting digital ag. How can we change that from a trusted advisor network or company side of things, whether that's incentives or it's training or it's whatever? What is the role of crop buyers of all kinds in FMIS adoption and data collection? So going back to that point about food and fuel company marketers or producers who market to food and fuel companies using FMIS at a significantly different rate. So how can the buyer of your crop, whether it's the local co-op or it's Pepsi or it's whoever, how can they impact and support and empower data collection? And then how best can we empower the next generation of farm management before and during the generational transition? So we know that, this happens all the time, but there's a lot of producers today who are getting closer and closer to their retirement date, their finish line, so to speak. And so how can we be working with, the sons and daughters and cousins and whoever is taking over that operation to get them up to speed and to get them to be ready to make the jump or be able to step into digital farm management fully once they're able to take the reins over, because we know it might not happen before that, but what can we do to make sure that as soon as they are in the driver's seat, they're ready to roll on things? So that's it for our presentation, unless Teresa, you had anything else you wanted to add. We've got a few questions here to seed for some Q&A, but if there's anything from the audience, I would love to entertain questions for a little bit. Norm, you might have to do some translating for us. It's kind of hard to hear those people on the back few rows. So if we get somebody from the back who's asking a question, if you can maybe repeat it for us so we can hear it.
Right, and if we could speak up too. So we'll give the attendees first crack at questions. What's your response? What things did you pull out of the presentation? Yes, go ahead, John, and stand up and speak loudly, and we see if we can hear.
I have a question. In your data, you talked about the fact that cost was a barrier, but looking at the later data, you translate that into got to make margin. So if I can make a return on the investment, it wouldn't be so much of a barrier.
Did you hear that, Drew?
Yeah, I think I got it. Let me answer, and then if I go the wrong way, maybe help me get back in lane. What we asked about barriers was specifically what barriers are preventing you from collecting and or sharing more data than you are today. And so cost was one of the choices that we provided. And our understanding of that is that it's the cost associated with sensors and hardware and physical technology that interacts with equipment or in the field to collect data. And then it's the cost associated with some sort of an FMIS system or subscription or whatever to be able to then use that data in a digital environment. So it could be any number of those things. Somebody, could have the software figured out. They just don't have the right tractor equipment, the right hardware out in the field. And it's a $30,000 upgrade for them to be able to do it, or, something like that. Now, when you start to link that to return on investment and the money that you could make from productivity increases, 2 seasons down the line, we didn't get into that. We didn't link those two things. We were just asking about barriers today, like this season. What would stop you from collecting more data than last year? And cost is what came up, right? So we didn't link it to ROI. We didn't link it to what you could make in the future. We just asked about right now, what's the biggest red flag you see?
That'd be interesting if you would link to a return. In future question.
This is the second year that you've done this survey, and I believe you changed some of the questions, but are you going to continue on in 2022 and change the methodology somewhat, or what are the plans?
Yeah, we are going to update. I think every year we're probably going to refresh and update the questions, maybe add some new ones. And so that's something to think about is, let's ask about barriers, and then let's ask about costs specifically. Maybe the hypothesis is if you get a return on investment equal to your investment in 2 seasons or 3 seasons or whatever, we can figure that out. Is cost still an issue if you're guaranteed ROI, or is it not an issue if you're guaranteed that ROI? But if there's not a guarantee of that ROI, then it is an issue because you're out that money. I think trying to figure out, is it an immediate access to capital issue, as in I don't have the capital this year, or is it that I'm afraid that I'm not going to get ROI, and so of course I'm not going to spend money on it, but I do have the money to do it this year, right? Trying to tease those two things apart would be really valuable.
That trade-off in ROI, that's all sometimes giving up management control of your business. There's all kinds of plans put together to guarantee a return in exchange for information and control. Is that, you see that as one trend?
So we haven't asked about that specifically. And I don't, it kind of falls into that trust bucket, but that's another thing that we should probably think about this year. Norm, maybe as we go to write this survey, I'll just set up a call with you and we can go through it together and think about things. But yeah, understanding that producers may not have the level of visibility or control that they used to have, that is something to think about.
Our group is, every one of them either uses, provides technology, or is a trusted advisor when it comes to farm management systems, information systems. And I'm sure we've got some responses to this. And one of the things I think just jumped out at me, the survey, only 2% of the respondents were between 18 and 34.
Yeah.
And is that reflect the overall demographics of farmers, or is that just the way that they didn't want to respond, or were too busy in social media to respond, or what was the?
I think it doesn't reflect farmers nationally, and I don't think it reflects row crop farmers, but I do think it reflects who answers surveys in today's day and age, and I do think it's reflective of the Farm Journal survey audience. Our survey audience tends to be older for whatever reason, so it's not to say that our publications and our audience as a whole doesn't have a strong 18 to 34 showing, but the people who answer surveys are the people, they tend to be older and they tend to be more involved, and that's just the way that it is. So I think that's probably a function of that, and I would look at it more as that, and not as only so few individuals are working in row crop agriculture at this age, or they're making decisions on farms, or they're operating in FMIS. I wouldn't look at it that way.
More responses from the audience here. Randy, and go ahead, stand up and speak loudly so Drew can hear you.
Yeah, so one of the things that strikes me is that the minimum response was 50-acre qualification. So likely, when we talk about ROI, if you're not utilizing the technology enough, you're not going to get an ROI on it, maybe. So where did you see a trend on as farm size or business size increases? Is there an adoption rate change?
Yeah, that is something that we looked into, and we've looked into it both years that we've done this survey. And the surprising thing is that aside from that really, really small acreage, like 50 to 179 or whatever the smallest is, it's fairly randomly distributed across acreage. Even when you get to those really big acreages, like 2,000 acre plus, we see a significant number of operations who aren't using it, but are operating thousands of acres. Likewise, we'll see plenty of people with 200 acres or 500 acres. and they are using it. So at least in terms of our sample and our survey, it seems to be fairly randomly distributed. And we have trouble saying that if you're above 1,000 acres, you're probably using FMIS, because that's just not what we're seeing when we do this survey. And it's happened twice now. So, I mean, we could get better about our survey methodology to say that it's a definitive thing in the real world, but I think it's more random than maybe we think that it is. Because I would agree that, yeah, if you're operating 2,000 acres, you're probably on some sort of software system. But we're having people tell us that they're not. So there has to be something to that, because if it was just somebody screwing up the survey or doing it wrong or not paying attention, you know, it would just be a couple little weird outliers here or there. But it's pretty evenly randomly distributed. So I think that's something to consider, is that maybe these larger operations aren't as sophisticated, or at least there's a significant number of large operations that aren't as sophisticated as we might think they are. And that's probably different geographically too, right? You guys are in Illinois right now. I'm sure that, you know, you go to other states, especially the farther out you get from the core Midwest heartland, and it might be different, right? 2,000 acres in Kansas might be very different than 2,000 acres in Illinois. It might be very different than 2,000 acres in Georgia, something like that.
In your 2020 survey, you drilled into the different vendors in the farm management information systems. You did not repeat that in 2021. Is it what's the reason? Didn't have large enough sample size, or what was it?
Yeah, so when we looked into that, we didn't really find anything useful there. So, I mean, each vendor, each company knows how many users they have. And so if we're just taking a small random sample, 610 individuals, for us to say, all right, 30% are climate field view, 20% are granular, 25% are John Deere, Trimble, whatever, that doesn't really, it doesn't really help us. We didn't think of any ways to be able to use that. So I think it's, rather than asking about brand specific usage rates, in the future, we need to think about maybe linking brand or type specific questions to performance, right? So if you're not happy with it, what is your software company? What is your vendor, and why? So then we can start to say, okay, everybody who says John Deere has these 10 feelings, and everybody who says granular says these 10 feelings, and climate field view, they say this. So I think we could get back into it, but I think we find more value in the kind of more broad population level questions, rather than, you know, saying how many people are using a specific software, because, you know, John Deere knows how many users they've got. Trimble knows how many users they have. Climate field view knows how many users they have. We can, you know, get to that stuff other ways. I don't know that it's a benefit. I haven't seen a benefit to asking just usage rates outside of, you know, linking it to performance or linking it to something really, really specific.
Another thing that jumped out at me was the highest level of trust, if I suppose frame it that way, was from financial institutions for sharing data. Did that surprise you, or is that?
No, it did. Absolutely. I mean, it makes sense now that, you know, once you see it and you think about it, because I certainly trust my bank more than I trust a lot of other organizations. And I don't even, you know, I don't have a ton of farm data. So it does make sense, but it was surprising. We don't know what to do with it today. I think there's lessons to take from the banking industry, because if you look at how the banking industry interacts with their customers, there's a very big relationship and trust component to it, right? Like, I mean, almost every single advertisement for any bank deals with trust and relationships. That's their entire identity. And so understanding that there's a reason that they're trusted, not just because of their identity, but how they treat their customers, and the significant firewalls that they put up to protect their customers' information, the banking information around people. That, I think, is lessons that could be applied elsewhere, especially around farmer data. You know, if you start to think of farmer data the same as you would someone's 401k or their, their checking account data or number, and start applying the same kind of logic that a bank would, you start to see where there's differences in FMIS and other data privacy policies and data situations. And that, that's a way to think about it. Something else I want to ask next year is similar to medical records, because you would think about your family's medical records and how protected those are, and comparing medical records to farm data records. That's another consideration.
Just to add to that, the issue with data is that it's not a tangible asset, so it's not considered property under US law right now. And we cannot look at it as intellectual property because there's not the creative aspect of it. So there's this huge uncertainty that is affecting the industry now, because what is data? Who owns data? According to US law now, current US law, the data doesn't belong to the farmer. They don't own that farm data. And so to Drew's point, I think the reason why financial institutions, there is so much trust there, it's because there is self-regulation. It's an industry that is heavily regulated, and also there's a lot of self-regulation going on there. And that is not currently applied to agriculture data. When we see the agreements between the farmer and the FMIS, for example, they say that data belongs to the farmer, but then they have unlimited license. When you really read the agreement, it says that they have unlimited license to do whatever they want with the data. So in other terms, if they can do whatever they want with the data, then the data doesn't really belong to the farmer anymore. And then how can we put a price on that? And that is a discussion because there's current lawsuits going on in the poultry industry where specifically against Tyson, because they're using the data that are provided by the growers against them to reduce their compensation. So they're collecting that data through a third party, and then using that data against them. So I think that's where the issue is coming from here. That's why trust is an issue here. It's uncertainties, lack of regulation. All of that is driving that trust issue.
And it's not going away. One last question, and did you have? Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yeah,
Kyrie?
Drew, not so much a question, just more a comment. Really, your research around trusted advisors kind of resonated with me. I work for Boehringer Ingelheim, which is an animal health company, and so the relationships in our organization are primarily with veterinarians. And the veterinarians are historically seen as trusted advisors for production systems. And I think as we move into a digital space, we're floundering a little bit with who are the trusted advisors that we send our customers as producers to. And so that's just something that I'm kind of thinking about with the marketing of a swine management platform, an in-barn swine management platform. Who can those producers trust to learn more about technology, to learn more about the data, because they're historically going to veterinarians who may not be the people who are up to speed in some of these areas. So I think that, like I said, not really a question, but just something that's kind of in my brain right now is who do we start sending our customers to be the trusted advisors, or who are we going to bring up in the swine space in order to be those experts?
And that might be what I was thinking as well. Is I don't think you've got a lot of breakdowns in trusted advisors, but I think the different specialties and levels might be helpful, saying who those are, because we know we need them. We just don't know what that looks like.
Yeah. And when you start looking outside of even in row crop, you've got an agronomist. You might have an agronomist that's attached to your input provider or retailer. You may have 3 or 4 different individuals. Then when you get into the livestock space, it's even more distributed, and there's not that single point or single company that you're working with. So I totally understand what you're saying. We're seeing that a lot. I'm doing a lot of beef research right now, similar to this, and we're seeing the same thing. Advisors are just not promoting these technologies at the level that they need to be. And so how do we get them up to speed? I think that the row crop industry is probably the farthest ahead in terms of its trusted advisor network, just because of the way ag retail and inputs works, and has worked historically. So you've at least got a leg up there. But I'm with you. I struggle to see what we do in the livestock space, but I know that it's coming and we're going to need to focus there.
Well, thank you very much, Drew and Teresa. Been very interesting. We're looking forward to your next year's report. Thank
Absolutely.
you. We'll give you, we'll recognize
Norm,
you. Go
Norm,
ahead.
I shared a copy of the presentation with you if you want to circulate it to anyone. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me or Teresa. We'd be happy to help you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.